Great, so I'll kick it off. All right, today's guest is the founding developer of WordPress, open source software used by over 35% of the web. Matt Mullenweg is also the CEO of Automattic, which is now the force behind WordPress.com, Jetpack, and many other products. Matt's built a 1,200 person remote company with no offices, distributed company, as Matt likes to call it, with no offices and employees scattered across 68 countries. We're really excited to have him on to talk today about distributed teams, the future of work, and also the open source movement. One other note, Matt recently launched his own podcast, which examines kind of the benefits and the challenges of distributed work, recruiting talented people all over the globe. It's called Distributed, which you can find on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. So welcome, Matt.
And so we're really excited to talk to Matt today. He and his team have built what I'd like to call actually like the operating system for distributed teams, including even a pretty clever playbook for how to most effectively organize people when in person, when not physically distributed. But he's been setting the standards here for how to scale this model, and the topic has never been more crucial to American corporate culture than right now with this sort of forced distributed work environment. So welcome to the show, Matt. And I have to just start off first question, Matt. What kind of software do you install on all your employees' computers to monitor them?
Yeah, I guess the software is whatever they're doing to work with, GitHub, support tickets. We try to really focus on just what the outcome is of whatever their work is. And of course, like any company, we want to measure those customer outcomes, but worry less about the input. So what windows are open, what their computer's doing, anything like that is of no interest to me, actually.
I was joking, of course. But
yeah, it's this kind of weird assumption, right? That like the way in which many cultures are is that if you're not in the office, you're not working, or you're like, screwing around. And I just love how you guys have kind of turned that whole idea on its head. In the session with Sam on the podcast, one of the things that really kind of caught my attention was this, you made this interesting point about like that distributed work is a moral imperative, which is a really interesting frame of distributed work, not just about like kind of the dollars and cents of it. Can you share a little bit more about what you mean by that, of this, distributed work being a moral imperative, Matt?
I believe that if you're able to, as a manager or running a business or a company, if you're able to allow people the freedom, autonomy, and agency to serve your customers in a way which provides them a lot more of that autonomy, then you should, because it will make their life significantly better. It's probably good for the environment. It's, has a ripple effect for the lives of everyone they interact with and how they're able to show up there. And if they are, if you're going to be purely self-interested capitalist about it, if that person is happier, more fulfilled, they're going to do better work as well, and show up better for your customers. So I think that there is, and if you're able to do it, you absolutely should. Now, part of being able to do it is practicing it and getting good at it. So a lot of companies right now are probably going through those early levels of distributed work where they're doing it for the first time and it's not going so well. And I will say that I have a lot of empathy for the thing we just joked about, which is, sometimes in the past people would work from home as a euphemism for not working that much, and especially if it were not the everyday, but like something that happened very rarely, they might use it as a day to run chores or errands or something like that without taking a day off. So these are the kind of things that perhaps gave a bad name to remote work in the past, and that we need to work doubly hard to vanquish as myths, right? Because that's not required or even I would say necessary or normal in a true distributed work environment.
Just touching on one of these points, and I read your post the other day on kind of the 5 levels of autonomy for distributed work, and I think that would be really helpful for our listeners and audience. Can we just kind of break that apart a little bit for those that are listening that maybe aren't so familiar with those 5 layers? Maybe you could describe them and then have a couple more questions to dig into there.
Yeah, the quick version is level 0 is for whatever reason the job can't be done unless you're physically present. So that's no distributed, and there's still a lot of great jobs like that. Level one is where, if you're not physically present, you can get by a little bit. If you had to work from home for a day, for example,
Yeah.
you could maybe do a few calls or something, but you're not really able to do your full job. Level two is where you can probably do your full job online. But the downside is that they're just recreating the office online. So whatever the ways of working together that you did when you were physically co-present, they try to recreate that. And so um, you could imagine this being like all the same meetings you were in before, but now you're just on Zoom instead of in conference rooms. Um, you might have to like VPN to a virtual, online office to be able to access certain resources, things like that. Level three is where the tools start to get better. So you're out of probably being worse than it was than if you were in the office, maybe back to where
Yeah.
you're doing things differently, but you're just as effective as you were when you were in the office. But still, the work is largely synchronous and probably feels a lot like when you're in an office.
Yep.
You just now have the support of the technology to be effective at it.
Yeah.
And then level four is when you can move to being asynchronous. So where you kind of use being kind of digital first in the way that you work together to unlock an asynchronous nature of most communication. And this allows a lot more flexibility for people and also allows the company then to tap into a truly global workforce and have people in whatever time zone or wherever they're working be equal contributors to the product moving forward. There's a level 5, but I call that nirvana, so that's unattainable. But imagine that as being like, you're doing all the good things from the earlier levels,
Yep.
and also each person is living a happy, fulfilled, well-balanced life, which then, as we said earlier, allows them to bring their very best to work.
So it seems like most of the world is kind of stuck between, well, like now people have been working from home, so maybe they're like, at level 2, but feels like so much of the world is kind of stuck between level 2 and level 4. You talked about on Sam's podcast, you talked about the Japanese relay team focusing on the handoff, and how optimizing the handoff in that relay team really made all the difference, and and how that could parallel remote work moving from level kind of 3 to level 4. So maybe you could talk a little bit about like what in your experience is like the most important things to optimize for when you're trying to go from level 3 to like level 4 of fully asynchronous communication.
So the good news is that I think that you move up the levels the longer you do this. It's inevitable. We've probably all heard from friends who are talking about being on Zoom calls for 7, 8, 9, 10 hours a day, and
Yeah.
just they're dying inside.
Yeah.
And which also means they're not doing their best work. And so that I think there's a natural breaking point there. Like we're just not designed to be on video for 10 hours a day, or even I would argue like more than 3 hours a day.
Yeah.
So at the point when you start to scale that back, you start to say, well, what are other ways to accomplish the same outcomes with maybe a different input? Much the same way that if you're, banging your head against nails trying to drive them in the wood, you might say, what's a different way to get this nail into the wood? What's a different tool we could use or a different way of doing it? And there's a lot of parallels to work in that, actually. In terms of unlocking the asynchronous nature, I think just doing it is what happens. So if you can start to eliminate some of those meetings and start to eliminate things that are requiring people to be synchronous or working the exact same hours, but you keep the same standards for what's being accomplished, I think you will naturally find people adapt to tailor their workday and their method of work in an individual manner to be whatever helps them accomplish the goals the best. And a key thing there is individual. So some people, and those people are not wrong, might do fantastic with like starting every day at 9 a.m. and maybe even going out of their house. Maybe they go to a co-working spot or a separate private office or something like that, and then turning the computer off at 5 p.m. Great. That's the most effective way you work. Do that. For some people, it might mean a day which is more broken up. So maybe they find that in the afternoons, their brain is just dead. and where they used to force themselves to stay at their desk, then they could use that time to run errands or take a nap or something like that, and then come back on and work a few extra hours later in the day when they have kind of like their best facilities about them. Or maybe they start early, or whatever it is that allows them to time shift their day to align the type of work they need to do with where their energy is in a given day.
Yep.
Is just one example of the numerous kind of customizations you can do to essentially individualize bringing your best self to work.
Yeah, it's funny. One of our core values at Brain Trust is bring your best self, and we talk specifically about this, which is that like if you're not in the right headspace, or if you got something else that's distracting you, like it's the time to step away, not to barrel straight through, right? You just can't do your best work when you're stressed or tired or exhausted from the beginning part of the day, and so it's an important part to be able to step away. And you touched on
One
something
cool
really
thing.
interesting. Oh yeah, go for it.
Oh, I think a lot of companies have these values, but I would argue that an in-office environment might actually be counter to them, even if the company says this is really important. Because,
Yeah.
like, certainly when I've been in an office, I feel weird leaving, right? Because, especially as an executive, like, if I leave, that signals to everyone. And so, how many people are kind of forcing themselves to keep their butt in the seat?
Yep.
Even if they truly believe and would tell others, like, hey, if
Yep.
exactly what you just said, like if you're not there, don't force yourself to be there, like do something to recharge.
Yeah.
Hey
There's
Matt,
something
switching gears a little bit. So I think I'm fascinated to take this, all the criteria that make a great workplace, and then reshuffle it through the lens of distributed. And I think it's like most of us are on board now with this fact that the data shows that a more diverse team produces better output, right? Like bar none, like no matter what sort of diversity you're talking about, but specifically gender and ethnic and geographic diversity. Does having a distributed team make that easier or harder, or and how do you think about it? You have a giant organization distributed. What are your thoughts around diversity and inclusion?
Yeah, I think that if you're global, it takes on a whole new um, set of factors. So I would say that for hiring folks, it really opens up the talent pool.
Yeah.
And the geographic constraints of in-office hiring, meaning people that can either commute to that office or move to commute to that office when you're hiring, by definition excludes 98% of the global population. So just by that alone, you have to think like mathematically. We can't be perfectly hiring an evenly, completely open, diverse set of candidates. So that just seemed very true on its surface. I will say that my understanding of the research is that the flip side of that is, or the other side of getting that increased effectiveness is the psychological safety of a diverse team. So people need to feel comfortable bringing their diverse backgrounds and the things that'll make the outcome to the table. And I would say that's still hard for every team, including a distributed one. And one thing that comes up a lot with any team, but I think that we're learning how to do this in a distributed way for the first time, is building trust between the team members, which I would say is a necessary precondition for any team being effective. And I would argue it's also a precondition for a diverse team getting the benefits of that diversity. So we, I think, as humans, have millions of years of learning how to build trust when we're together in person. And those things come very naturally to us because we've probably done it our whole life, starting from our family, right? I 100% believe that there are really good ways to build trust when we're not in the same room together, and we need to get better at them because we don't have that muscle right now in many organizations, and even in Automattic. Prior to the pandemic, we would tell people to expect 3 to 4 weeks of travel per year, and in those 3 to 4 weeks, we would bring people together physically. And we found that actually we felt like we had no kind of downside in terms of the trust within the team. So we found that even just a few weeks out of the year could really build those intense bonds between everyone that then you build on in the work. And we too are now in a space where we're trying to practice how to build that trust when we're not going to be together. maybe for a long time.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It's a huge challenge. I mean, I'd be it'll be interesting to see, because this will eventually go back to normal, right? We'll be able to get together again. But I think this forcing function of us all being this distributed for this long period of time will force us to figure out how to build trust in other ways. So I'll be curious to hear what you guys out on the bleeding edge learn about this.
Yeah, and honestly, we're not sure when we'll ever get together again. Because if you look at it, we have folks in 77 countries.
Right.
There's going to be different restrictions on travel across those countries, different impact of the pandemic, different access to vaccine, and very similar to when Zika started happening. We couldn't, in good conscience, ask any colleague who, with the impacts of Zika being somewhat unknown at the time, and it could have a very serious health impact on babies and be passed even through partners. All those kind of factors is like we stopped doing any meetups in places that could be affected by Zika, because if even one member of the team has that concern, you don't want to force them to choose from connecting with their team and possibly being exposed to this risk, even though the risk, as we understood it, was, as a percentage-wise, pretty small. If it happened, the impact was really, really large.
Yep.
COVID is obviously a version of that we're still developing our understanding of. And again, also has a factor where you might be able to pass it on to someone else that, again, could have a higher risk factor. So I think it's going to be tough for us to ask any of our colleagues to travel for work if we think that we can get some of the same benefits in a distributed fashion.
Yeah. There's got to be something there, right? It's not just like us sitting around in a Zoom room together, right? There's got to be something else clever here that we can figure. Maybe it's VR headsets. I don't know.
Yeah. There's got to be something, right? There's got to be some other kind of dimension that makes the experience, like, takes it from 2D and like gives you another sense, brings in the other senses.
It's fun to try to deconstruct, right? Like, I've been thinking recently about the aspect of play. Mm-hmm. And sort of building trust and kind of getting people to be comfortable with each other outside of the normal work context. And maybe that would manifest as like a fun game or charades or even things that would happen kind of ad hoc, like you're at an Airbnb that has a pool table and people start playing pool together, whatever it is, And so how do you recreate that play in a distributed fashion? And first I'm like, well, how do you play a game of pool? But then I'm like, wait, there's billions of people playing video games and it's the Fortnites of the world and all these things that I personally don't know a lot about, but like I'm seeing this being a huge cultural force. So like, is there something there? And what is kind of an inclusive or a way to recreate some of those aspects of play? And then I don't know if you've ever tried an app like House Party, which actually has kind of some of these games recreated in a Zoom-like fashion, in a way that's actually pretty fun, because you can have like a question pop up on the screen or do things like, what was that one from Ellen that you would hold the screen on your forehead and everyone else would see it, but you wouldn't? Like you can do that in a non-physical way pretty easily on a digital video platform that I think could be fun to do.
The irony is that we took the family to Disney over the Christmas break last year, and we're, even with fast passes, we're still like just withering away in these lines. And that's what we were doing, is holding our phones up to our head and playing whatever game that was. Like, the irony that we're all, clustered physically here together, and like we rely on these digital games to pass the time.
I think it's called Heads Up. It's a fun one too.
That's what it is. Along those lines, Matt, what do you think happens to office space? I remember you guys had this really beautiful office in San Francisco, and like it just kind of, it deprecated itself basically, and this will be a slower trend for other companies that aren't as comfortable with distributed. But, I think we're all realizing now, like, that open office architecture was just totally nonsense. It violates the autonomy aspect of controlling your work environment. And I think you've made a lot of great points on this topic. Like, what happens to commercial space? I mean, humans still want to connect, right? I mean, what do you think happens?
I don't know. It's a big challenge, right? Like if I were to design a perfect office after working from home, it would maybe look a lot like Fog Creek Software did, or even Microsoft, where you give everyone like an office with a door, and they can focus, and they can have the door open or closed.
Back to the
then
old
for collaboration, Oh, what was that?
Back to the old law firm model, right? Where everybody has a
Yeah.
door that closes.
Yeah.
But,
Interesting.
being in a small room with someone else is also not great for transmitting
Yeah.
a disease, right? And so, or
Yeah.
in closed places with circular air. So I really don't know what happens to this commercial space. I'll tell you something I've been thinking of and actually starting to experiment with myself personally, which is outdoor hangouts.
Yeah.
So maybe the future of like how we collaborate or get together might actually be not inside at all. And of course, that has a whole number of other issues like weather and especially in Houston where it's hot. But actually, we talked about what I did over the weekend. One thing I did do over the weekend is I have one colleague who actually lives here in Houston as well, and we're pretty close. We've worked together well over a decade, and for a month or two ago, he had a drive-by birthday where his friends and neighbors would literally drive by in their cars and kind of wave to him on the lawn. And as the weekend was approaching, I said, "Hey, what if we do like a social distance hangout? So we're like, hang out in your backyard and have some kolaches." And so Sunday morning we actually did that, and it was really nice to, you know, it was tough not being able to give him a hug, or the things we might normally do if we saw each other. But it was really nice to have that kind of physically present, but hopefully safe kind of presence with each other. And it felt like a good balance of being able to connect and be safe. We actually didn't talk about work at all. It was more catching up as friends, but or hardly. I think we talked about work a little bit, but it wasn't like a work meeting. But I wonder if that could be a way that, who knows, maybe if we can do a board meeting in the future, with like a bunch of us in a park, 10 feet away from each other, and just having a loud conversation.
Yeah. Listen, I think some of Adam and I's best work happens over hikes, right? Just
Mm,
getting outside and like getting the blood pumping and like hashing through things that you maybe couldn't do just sitting in front of a computer. So I hope that
yeah.
opens up kind of a new way where you can spark ideas and have conversations.
And it's worth noting, like this is also based on what we understand in kind of like the second week of June to being
Yeah.
the best, safest thing to do, and that
Yeah.
could change in the future. Like,
Sure.
um, so it's all a point in time, and I don't know where that's going to go, which is why I'm hesitant to predict what's going to happen with the offices or not. I have some friends in finance that are investing, you know, high eight figures in retrofitting their office to have like essentially create green zones where there's temperature checks and all the surfaces are being sanitized and there's UV lights and all this kind of like really like
Yeah.
space age, almost like hospital level of sanitization that's happening in their office. Personally, a lot of why I would want to go to an office is negated by those types of measures.
Yeah.
So at that point, I question like why we're all going into the same
Yeah.
building. Um,
Yeah.
but to me, it's also fascinating that this could also be like a really interesting area of investment, especially for those who maybe have already invested hundreds of millions or billions of dollars into real estate, is retrofitting that to have people be together safely, or maybe even have it be a green zone of sorts
Yep.
where you're 99.9% certain everyone there is safe to be around from the point of view of like COVID or something.
Mhm.
I think there's a big prize for whoever reinvents the elevator.
Hmm.
Tough sell these days to get in a
Yeah.
8x5 box for 7 to 9 minutes with 20 other strangers.
And architecture was designed to have those have more than one person at a time in them, right? Like,
Mhm.
so these are tough problems that will be difficult, I think, to retrofit a lot of these systems.
They're talking about like the lines for people to get to the top of Salesforce Tower, right? Because it's only
Mm.
like they're doing one person at a time going up the elevator to the top of the Salesforce Tower right
Wow.
now. It
Yeah,
could be a
I've
while.
seen it even when I visited friends for lunch in one of these big office buildings. Like it gets totally untenable, and you
Yeah.
have to build in, um, like an extra 15 minutes into getting to a meeting on time because you don't know what the delay's going to be. It's traffic, right? So the same way that like in San Francisco or Manhattan, you started to have to put like a 30-minute buffer into how long it should take you to get there. Like now you're having to do that in elevators within buildings, which kind of, again,
And
defeats the
it's
purpose
like
of the efficiency
it's
of
like
being in the same space.
it doubles people's commute time, as if commutes weren't already bad enough. Now you have to tack on another 30 minutes to go from the base of the building to your office. Maybe that's the tipping point for people just like completely getting fed up with commutes, and also the fact that you're in an office and you can't hang out with other people and jam in a closed whiteboard room, a space, the things that we usually think, or hanging out at the coffee machine or the water cooler.
Mm.
These things, maybe this is the tipping point for when the office just like the economics of an office just start to really decline quickly.
Or of apartment buildings, right? Like this
Yeah,
applies to our personal life as well. And when you
yeah,
need to go out to walk the dog or something,
yeah,
how's that going to work for people that are in the same building and the elevators there? And so,
yeah,
these are second and third order effects that I don't really know. And,
yeah,
working in the environmental space, I'm very familiar with the benefits, especially to the environment of urban density
yep,
brings. But in Houston, my friends in real estate have already told me that there's a lot of people who are in these, especially mid-rise apartments, are now starting to look at, kind of these single unit dwellings with a driveway and a door on the ground level.
yep, yeah,
Matt, I want to switch gears a little bit here to another topic that I think you've always been especially prescient about, and I know very passionate about on the kind of on the .org side of your domain with open source software. Um, so, I was like a very early WordPress customizer and kind of mini contributor, and always been a big fan of the platform and the family. And then we've, one thing I think is interesting about open source is it's always had this kind of odd missing piece around incentives. It kind of hasn't really mattered, right? It's like done really well, but like, there could be like a hole in SSL for 15 years that nobody finds because no one's really paid to update it. And then all of a sudden, like everyone's banking connections aren't safe because we found the hole. But then came along this kind of token model, right? Which, the blockchains and tokens, which are in of themselves open source systems, which turns out makes them strong. But we have this new interesting thing where like you could create an incentive layer around a project and have it be decentralized, and lots of cool experiments around solving poverty of the commons. So look, I'd love to hear your take on like the tokens impact to this open source world. At Brain Trust, we're building what we call a user-owned economy, where the software replaces the middleman, and the token takes that big margin and big rake and just gives it back to the users programmatically, trustlessly, right? I'd love to just hear your take on this ecosystem. Sorry, that was like 20
Oh,
questions.
that is, and it's a very tricky area. Um, I'll illustrate with one example of where, um, a commercial, what seems on the surface like extension or plugin authors making lots of money from their extensions or plugins can actually be worse for the ecosystem. And I think there should be a case study on this. And again, I'll also say that this is just based on my knowledge as an outsider, but there's another open source project called Joomla, which actually used to be a similar size to WordPress in the early days, or even bigger. So it's an open source CMS. And and then again, now we get to where I'm just editorializing and could be totally wrong, but this is
Please,
my
that's why
interpretation
I
of what
asked.
happened, is they created a really, their sort of extension directory, or in WordPress, what we call plugins. They created a kind of an integrated payment system, almost like an app store, that worked really well. So all of a sudden you had people who might not have made any money in the past before making hundreds of thousands of dollars from their plugins. So they solved that problem of the plugin developers not making money, and you could argue that then that leading to like a lower quality or security bugs or things like you just said. It created a new problem, which was balkanization, meaning that no longer was there an incentive to collaborate the same way that was in the past? And this manifested in two ways. And we've seen this happen in WordPress as well, where all of a sudden, if there were two plugins doing a similar thing, there could be a good argument in the past for them to combine the efforts. It's often when open source works best. Like, hey, we're all reinventing the wheel. Let's just make one wheel and make it open source and free so we can all build a car instead of wheels, right? It removed that incentive. Second, it removed the incentive for some of these features to go into core software. So all of a sudden, if, let's say, Joomla core or WordPress core were considering taking this feature that was a very interesting plugin, and it being its own separate thing that you had to buy was making someone 100 grand a year, and that was their mortgage and their kids going to college and everything like that. But it costing, even if it was just a dollar, was holding back the growth of the platform quite a bit. So now you get kind of almost an adversarial aspect to what features are going in the core and then what grows the core platform. And this is that's very challenging, right? Because one of the things platforms always do is experimentations happen at the edge, and then it comes in the core and becomes available to everyone, and then that becomes like a multiplier, and then hopefully that creates more opportunities. But if it never comes in the core in the first place, often I think what happens is the core platform atrophies. You get an aspect where users can feel very nickel and dimed. So it would be like if you bought your phone, but then everything you wanted to do, if you want to take a picture, you had to buy this $5 app. If you wanted to, make a phone call, it was another $5. Like you would feel kind of nickel and dimed and probably leave for a platform that integrated and bundled some of these things, right? Was it Jim Bankoff who said like all opportunity businesses from bundling things and unbundling things, right? Like, it kind of breaks the bundling and unbundling process, or at least removes some of the shared incentives that exist in a normal sort of open source project where there might not be as much explicit incentives or compensation happening for some of the activity within it. Finally, I'll just throw out there an academic concept which I became familiar with through the writing of Dan Ariely, but I don't know if he invented this, which is the idea of market versus social norms and incentives. And to again butcher and summarize this, it's the idea that like you might have an aunt who spends 5 hours making that amazing casserole for the Thanksgiving dinner that you all do together, or 10 hours making it, and it's like a real labor of love. But this aunt might also be an attorney that normally charges $500 an hour for her work. If you were to say, hey, Aunt Judy, I'd love that casserole next Tuesday. Could I pay you $5,000, her market rate, to make that casserole? She might be insulted and also be like, no, like, it kind of, and it kind of breaks that whole process. Where if you said, hey, like I really would love that casserole, I've been missing it. I know it's not Thanksgiving, but you might do it, for love, not money. Or I hope I summarized that correctly. I see you nodding, so you might understand the concept outside of that. But
Well, the analogy you're
sometimes I
making
think that
here.
happens in open source as well.
Yeah, I mean, so open source projects have a lot of passion behind them. I mean, I remember contributing to the PHP project to get a better link between PHP and MySQL, right? Which at one point in the early 2000s, there was not a good link between those. And, I made my living building PHP, MySQL based applications. And I was very passionate about it. And I felt like an owner. I feel like tokens can quantify that value of what you bring to the project and pay you almost a tail, almost a dividend on your contribution to something by if the token economy is designed properly. This is like pretty new stuff, and you can't point to a ton of people who are doing this well. You point to a ton of people who've done it poorly or scammed. But still, like, I mean, have you thought about any of these token economies? Have you thought about introducing a token to the WordPress area? Like,
immensely, yeah.
Tell me more about
because
it.
I love crypto stuff, and so it's really fascinating to me, these ideas. I think some people misunderstand my position as being that money is not a good motivator, or some sort of incentive is not a good motivator. Yeah. It's actually the opposite. And this is also why I don't believe in bonuses inside a company. I think that these incentives are incredibly good motivators for whatever you design the incentive to incent. And that probably needs to change over time. And when we lock these things in to allow them to ossify, the incentive structures to ossify, I think it prevents whatever the norms are for what's going to take the project to its next level, to not evolve alongside the needs of the market. And so this manifests in the open source projects, I think, by them drifting out of kind of congruence with the product market fit of their users and becoming irrelevant. Open source projects almost never die. They just kind of like wither. I think you can still find like the Slashdot code out there somewhere or the corrosion code or whatever it was. PHP nuke is still running someplace, but it doesn't matter. And then some have a flywheel effect where they get more users, which gets, improves the software, which gets more users. And that becomes kind of unstoppable. It's what we've seen happen with Wikipedia, or in some ways Android or WordPress or some of these other like ultra successful. Go ahead.
Or Ethereum.
Or Ethereum or Bitcoin, yeah. Some of these projects I think have that positive flywheel. It's almost like virality. Like if you're above 1.0, it will be unstoppable. If you're below 1.0, there's a decay that eventually will lead to complete irrelevance. And I think that, at least I've seen in my career so far, that what's most important and what you want to incent actually does change over time.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Like Reddit, for example, right? Reddit's got this strong network effect business, very high, like a very, very low signal to noise ratio potentially, right? So you want to incentivize good posting, positive commenting, curation, right? You're incentivizing curation. So they, have implemented a credit system, and then it saw that it was working, and then they're going to tokenize those things for certain subreddits. I think it's the
Oh, interesting.
The Bitcoin. Do you know about this, Matt? Have you read about this? Like they're tokenizing two of their popular subreddits, Fortnite and crypto. And those are going to be ERC20s. Like, curious if you have any thoughts on that. Like, and could you imagine something like that, like being implemented in a WordPress ecosystem?
I guess my thought on it is that's super interesting, and I want to see how it goes. It's intellectually very appealing to me. Much in the same way universal basic income is. And I'm really interested to see kind of the science and the data of how that manifests itself. I've seen some attempts at this go really poorly in the past as well. And even, if they're not tokenized, like the Joomla one I talked about in the past, I think that was one of the things that, in my perception, was a distinguishing decision that WordPress made versus Joomla. We've always kept our plugin directory. There's no built-in monetization or payment gateways or anything like that. And I think that actually has benefited WordPress as a whole. And then later, in the long term, all WordPress plugin developers, even though in the short term it might have meant it was less easy for them to monetize, selling a plugin for $1 or something. So yeah, super curious. We'll see where it goes. I think that, in life, we have to beware of false proxies. So we say that we're designing the incentive system or the algorithm to optimize for X, but we might not be. A good example of this might actually be Facebook. We're designing the system to highlight the content that gets the most engagement. They maybe, I bet someone said at one point, we're going to highlight the good content, and the algorithm's going to optimize for that. And it turned out it doesn't know what's good or not. It knows what gets clicks. It knows what gets attention. It knows what gets donations, or whatever it is that it's defining as the survival function for enhancing this algorithm. And that turned out doing some unintentional side effects. Famously for Facebook, like highlighting really divisive content or controversial content that gets a rise out of us, content that speaks to our lizard brain. I'd be very curious to see if clicks are not that much different from clicking a donate button. And in fact, our political systems, I think, have had similar incentive structures. And as we lower the friction for donating and payments, they have begun to also favor very what's the word for content that really incites strong emotions? There's a word that's escaping me.
Stuff.
Yeah. Things that really get a rise out of you, right? Like, gosh, if you see these fundraising emails, like It's almost like a really interesting like persuasion psychology masterclass.
Yeah.
And is that healthy for democracy? No, in my opinion. So
Yeah, those
how do we
algorithms
also create this?
they didn't take into account human nature and human emotions,
Yeah.
right? And it's and that's what we saw, or what we're seeing on Facebook. And so, yeah, it's a good point you're making around incentives. Like, really, you really have to experiment on what behavior you're incentivizing before you call it a success.
It's also it's a whole new canvas, right? Like for entrepreneurs. I mean, that was the part that got me most excited about blockchain and crypto. It wasn't actually the money use cases. It was actually the ability to program new incentives, and to be able to like look at that as a new canvas where you could build new things that you couldn't previously build in kind of like the legacy marketplaces and things like that. I want to be conscious of time, and actually we do a fun thing, just kind of a lightning round of kind of like one sentence answers. So
That's going to be so hard for me.
I thought it would be fun for you. So first one here. What have you learned about yourself during shelter in place?
Ooh, I've learned that I flew over 500,000 miles last year, and that when I stopped moving, some things caught up to me that I think I've been pushing away or ignoring. Much like silence makes room for some things that might have been there, but you wouldn't hear before.
Yeah.
I love that one. I that was my most profound thinking too. Is like, wow, I've got to like really kind of deal with some things that I've been pushing off, and it's been so valuable, right?
Yep.
Here's another one. So if you could fast forward any specific business, not necessarily name the business, just a function, by 5 years, what would it be and why?
If I think of humanity, it would have to be something around healthcare. And, if there's something around delaying the onset of the big 5 diseases, or an area, Adam, you know way more about than me, that feels like it could have a really profound impact on everything else.
Silicon Valley, on the way up or on the way down? Why?
Silicon Valley is a geography, um, probably flat. I don't know if I call it down. It's still like an awesome part of the world with like great weather and everything like that. But Silicon Valley is a mindset, I think, way on the way up. And we're just seeing it, what's replacing Silicon Valley is not like New York or another geography. It's really just, it's being uploaded to the cloud. It's the metaverse.
Yeah. The weather's still good, regardless of all the other crazy stuff here. I can still say that.
Honestly, if I could live anywhere in the world, San Francisco might be my pick, or the Bay Area might be my pick. It's just, shockingly gorgeous and amazing in a lot of ways. Now, there's a lot of trouble, I think, is coming from it growing up a little too fast and the infrastructure not supporting it. But it is, I think, objectively a pretty cool place. I say this as someone who's traveled all over the world.
Yeah. Matt, you made a comment to me once. I think we were on a charity water trip in Ethiopia, but it really stuck with me. You were saying very offhand, you were saying like how much you love what you do occupationally, and you just never want to stop doing it. I think somebody asked you like, when are you going to sell WordPress or something like that? And like, you were just like, I just don't think about it that way. I just love what I do every day, and I just don't want to stop. And
yeah.
It really resonated with me, and it stuck with me for years. I think that trip was, 5, 6, 7 years ago. Like that's nirvana for most people. And this is a hard thing to answer in 1 or 2 sentences, but I'm going to put you on it anyway. Like what advice would you give to people who feel stuck right now, who want to get there, who want to feel that way that you felt when you said that to me?
Something that was influential for me there was the accounts of unhappiness of people who had achieved what I thought would be success. Let's say selling your company and you have $100 million. And how many end up returning to work. And so work being maybe something that's very fundamental. Especially older folks I know that could be billionaires at this point, like they still work because there's something in the work that they find very satisfying. So I was like, okay, well, how do I not make that mistake of like having to sell something that I think I enjoy and then want to be doing it again? How can I kind of, what are the aspects of the work that are really feeding me versus the ones that are draining me? And really zooming out over the long term. I will say that the answer is still true, and that I'm really loving what I'm doing. I have not sold it in the 8 years since that Ethiopia trip, and it's I would love to continue doing what I'm doing with WordPress and Automattic the rest of my life. You know, whether that's independent or public or private or whatever it is. I really want to continue doing work just like I'm doing. Now that doesn't mean that there's not really hard days or weeks or sometimes even months. And I'm in the middle of a really hard week right now. Very, very, very challenging. There's a lot of really tough stuff going on. Some mistakes that have been made, some challenges in the company, some HR issues, like tons of things that are happening. I'm like, wow, this is tough, and I'm losing sleep over it, and it's hard, and everything like that. So I guess the second thing I want to say is, if you see someone like me saying like, I want to keep doing what I'm doing the rest of my life, doesn't mean that sometimes it's not just like, it's hard in a way that's causing you to lose sleep and really like have some really down days and even question what you're doing. So that happens to me too. It doesn't mean you're not on the right path, but zoom out and do that thought experiment of, okay, if I had $100 million tomorrow, what were the first things I would do? And then what would I do a month from now, a year from now, 10 years from now?
Yeah. Well, hey, I think that's a perfect place for us to start to kind of wrap here. Thank you so much for joining us today, Matt. It's a fantastic conversation. Where can people kind of reach you, find out more about your thoughts, opinions, perspectives on distributed work and how to build kind of the companies of tomorrow?
Sure. On social, Photomat, Photomatt, on Tumblr, Twitter, and Instagram, although I'm currently taking a break from Twitter. My blog is ma.tt, and I blog about a lot of these topics. And I started a podcast and a site called distributed.blog, which is trying to just gather the best practices from companies that are working in distributed fashion and share them. So if you feel like you're stuck in level 2, that podcast and the posts and resources on that site might help you get to level 3 or 4.
I have to say, I buzzed through, maybe not buzzed through, fully listened to at 1.2x speed, maybe 4 or 5 episodes over the last week from your distributed podcast, and
Thank you.
Really high quality work, really valuable conversations,
Yep.
and appreciate you doing it.
Thank you.
Well,
Matt,
we'll be happy to join and be a guest talking about the third wave of marketplaces and user-owned economies.
Totally. That would be a cool topic.
thanks for being here,
Be a real
Matt.
fun one. Thanks so much for joining us. Have a great day.